I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Joseph Smith was still on the run from Missouri. He'd been released on the technicality on his writ of habeas corpus, but Missouri was still trying to get him within state boundaries to prosecute him for his crimes. Those crimes were accessory before the fact to attempted murder of a public official, that's Lilburn W. Boggs, and of course all the old Missouri Mormon war charges from 1838, that's arson, robbery, and high treason. Joe was technically a fugitive from Missouri after his escape from custody in the spring of 1839, and if he stepped foot in the state, whether of his own volition or in the custody of constables or bounty hunters, he'd be arraigned in court on all those old charges and then sent to the gallows where he belonged. To complicate matters, Joe's underground enforcer, Orrin Pistolpack and Porter Rockwell, misnamed as the Destroying Angel of Mormonism, he was currently languishing in various jails throughout Missouri. But Joe had a new friend appear on the scene, Joseph H. Jackson, who promised that he'd break Port out of jail and finish the botched Lilburn Boggs job while he was there. So Joe had acquired a horse and some provisions for Jackson to make the trip to Missouri from Nauvoo, and he had also promised Jackson that he'd pay him a handsome $3,000 for a job well done. Commissioning Jackson to break Port out of prison was literally the only thing that Joe did to try and help his childhood friend out of jail in, his time of need. As we progress from spring to summer of 1843, tensions were high in Nauvoo. With the looming threat of a militia marching into Nauvoo to arrest Joe and hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt currently in default, and the expansion of the political power of the Mormons, the kingdom on the Mississippi was beginning to look more like a house of cards every day. At the appointed time, Joseph H. Jackson began his journey to Missouri to fulfill his mission of breaking out Port and killing Lilburn Boggs. We pick up from his account of how his journey transpired. Quote, "The next morning after this adventure, I took my departure for Missouri. The weather was very bad, the streams high, and I suffered very much with the wet and cold. After a journey of 8 days, I arrived at Independence, where I put up with a Mr. Knowlton. At this time, the Chavis murderers were arrested, and I saw them in custody of the sheriff while on their way to the jail. While these men were being put into prison, I entered it for the purpose of seeing Rockwell, that I might give a straight account of myself. I found him with a pair of shackles on and a lion skin overcoat, looked rather uncouth. There were, however, so many in prison at this time that I had no opportunity to converse with him. My hope was that by representing myself as being in the employ of Joe and convincing him of that fact, to draw from him a confession that might be useful for the purposes which Harmon T. Wilson and myself had in view. Previous to my leaving Carthage for Nauvoo, I had learned from Harmon T. Wilson that he was in correspondence with Mr. Reynolds, Sheriff of Jackson County, Missouri, in relation to another demand from the governor of Missouri for Joe Smith." Brief pause here. Harmon T. Wilson and Sheriff Reynolds. Those two will figure heavily into our episode today. Continuing on. An arrangement had been entered into that a requisition should be made on the return of Mr. Wilson from a trip which he contemplated to take to the south, immediately on the opening of navigation. Had I thought at the time I left Mr. Wilson of this trip to Missouri, I should have brought a letter from him to Mr. Reynolds, which would have disclosed to the latter my true character. As matters, however, were, I found myself placed in a situation where I could do no good towards the great object I had in view. A brief pause to contextualize that information a little bit. Joseph H. Jackson had the idea that he was going to infiltrate the Mormons and do so with the blessing of Mr. Reynolds, Sheriff Reynolds of Jackson County of Missouri. And when he was at an advantageous position, he would help Sheriff Reynolds arrest Joseph Smith. However, he was unable to get a meeting with these guys in order to, quote, disclose the my true character, end quote, to them. So he was just kind of on a fool's errand at the end of all of this. He continues, "There was great excitement in Independence in consequence of the Chavis murders. Many persons were arriving to join the Oregon immigrating expedition, and every stranger appeared to be looked on with distrust and suspicion. Mr. Reynolds was so busily engaged in arresting the Chavis murderers that I could get no opportunity to make his acquaintance and fix upon a concerted plan of operations in relation to Smith. Seeing the impossibility of effecting what I desired, and having no idea of attempting what Joe sent me for, I resolved to return to Nauvoo. Previous to taking my departure, however, I wrote to Mr. Wilson and directed my letter to Point Coupe, Louisiana, supposing that it would reach him there, but it appears that he never received it. Having been in Independence 1 week without effecting anything, I set out on my journey. My trip back was very pleasant, the roads having become settled and the weather dry. I struck the Mississippi at Churchville, crossed to Warsaw, and thence journeyed to Nauvoo." End quote. So to recap this journey, Joseph Jackson wasn't successful in anything that he set out to do. He initially departed Nauvoo, promising Joe that he would A, break Porter Rockwell out of prison, and that didn't happen, and he didn't even get to talk to Pistol Pack and Port in the jail because there was so much commotion, and B, he told Joe that he would finish off Lilburn Boggs, but he didn't even make an effort to assassinate him, even if he had actually wanted to. But then Jackson also wanted to meet with Sheriff Reynolds of Missouri to tell him that he was in the process of infiltrating the Mormon hierarchy and that they could work together to try and get Joe in Missouri custody. But because of all of the commotion with the Chavez murders, he wasn't even able to meet with the sheriff and tell him what was going on. So at every point in Jackson's trip to Missouri, it was a failure. That's true whether you're on Joe's side or on the anti-Mormon side trying to bring justice on the Mormon demagogue. However, Jackson was able to gather intel for Joseph Smith. Always keep in mind, this is the 19th century, before telegraphs even were invented. Information traveled at the pace of a galloping horse across the nation, and the information that Jackson was able to gain was very helpful to Joseph Smith. That information is the fact that Sheriff Reynolds of Missouri was currently working on a plan to get into Nauvoo and arrest Joe with updated documentation that didn't have the legal loopholes that Joe used to escape custody with his writ of habeas corpus back in January. So when Jackson returned to Nauvoo, he sought out a meeting with Joe to update him on how the mission went. He inserts a few interesting details, including a brief sketch of Emma and the fact that Joe liked to gossip with his circle of elites around town. Undoubtedly, Joe had told some of his trusted friends that Jackson had left to break out Port and to kill Boggs, which Jackson wasn't able to do, but when he arrived, he was treated as if he had been successful. Quote, "On my arrival, I rode to the house of the prophet, where all seemed glad to see me, and Sister Emma, Joe's wife, received me very cordially, the prophet not being at home. Since I have introduced this lady to the reader, I will mention that although she is acquainted with all the villainous plans and operations of Joe, yet she should be looked on with pity rather than scorn. I believe she knew no guile until Joe schooled her to wink at his rascality, and compelled her by threats to aid in carrying out his measures. Indeed, he has frequently said that it was with the greatest difficulty that he could prevail on Emma in many cases to hold her peace and not expose him to the world. In order to amuse myself until the prophet's return, I strolled over the city and was surprised to find so much attention paid to me, and that many, especially the women, knew all about my expedition to Missouri, convinced me that Joe could not keep his secrets, but I could not know at the time he had so many wives to whom to disclose them. When night came on, the prophet returned." End quote. So now, after, prowling around town, Jackson was back in Joe's house, about to tell him how this mission went. Now, this was actually a dangerous situation for Jackson to be in. If he let on that he hadn't been successful because he had no real intention of being successful in the first place, then his grand plans to infiltrate the Mormon elite circle would be discovered, and he wouldn't make it out of the city alive. However, if he could tell the story of his Missouri trip to Joe in just the right way, Joe would buy into it, and he would consider Jackson even more trustworthy than before his departure, even though Jackson had failed his mission. This was kind of a tense moment for Jackson, and this is how he reports the meeting. And of course, you'll find a link to his entire expose in the show notes. Quote, "Joseph seemed glad to see me, and, taking me by the hand, led me into a private room and commenced his inquiries about Porter Rockwell. He fixed his eyes steadily on me while I gave an account of my stewardship, and suffered me to proceed, about halfway through without interruption, when he suddenly exclaimed, 'Oh, did you kill old Boggs?' 'No,' said I, 'he was not at home.' And this was the fact, as good luck would have it, and it gave me an excellent excuse. Joe seemed to regret this very much, but soon returned to Rockwell's case and prophesied, in the name of the Lord, that he would, after passing through this fiery ordeal of the Missouri tribulation, come home safely. He said he knew they could prove nothing against him, for he was a true man, and they could not make him own a word of it if he was guilty." End quote. So Boggs wasn't dead, Port was still in prison, and Joe was no better off than when Jackson had initially departed. You can sense the tension in the rest of the meeting. Quote, "Silence ensued for a few minutes, when Joe suddenly looked me full in the eye, and after gazing steadily for a few moments said, 'Jackson, you are the first man that I have ever met that I could not look down.' Said I, 'Do you like a bold eye?' He replied that he did, and then commenced a panegyric on himself." End quote. So Joe was trying to size up Jackson here, trying to decide if he was gazing into the eyes of a friend or a foe. He probably saw him as a possible strong ally, but somebody whom he couldn't quite pin down. So after this awkward little interaction, Joe decided to float out a trial balloon to see how Jackson would deal with it. Quote, "He said that he was a good and godly man, and that he had never known wrong in his life, for in all his acts he was guided and protected by the power of the Holy Ghost, that the Missourians had tried to kill him, but rifle balls could have no effect on him, for he had been shot at 13 times in Missouri, and the balls bounded back as hail from the side of a house. And for this reason he knew the Holy Ghost was with him, and that he truly was the greatest man on the earth. To this I replied that it was altogether unnecessary for him to preach rascality to me in the name of the Lord, for the more he did it, the less I should think of him." End quote. So Jackson drew a line. Joe could preach about how he was persecuted by the Missouri mobocrats, but Jackson was no sycophant like the thousands of Mormons living in Nauvoo. He wouldn't buy the pile of manure that Joe was serving up. Instead, Jackson decided to take a different approach to test Joe's character. He decided it was time to ask Joe about his first few days in Nauvoo back in 1842. When Jackson had first appeared on the scene, the Mormons thought him to be a spy, and they tried to kill him. He was shot at while moving some cargo for a shop owner in town, just trying to make a buck to survive. The unknown would-be assassin fled into the night as Jackson recovered from the powder burn on his face. The bullet had missed. So Jackson decided to tell Joe this story to see how Joe would react. Quote, "I then related what had occurred to me the previous fall in Nauvoo, giving him a full account of my being shot at, not letting him know, however, that I suspected him or cared anything about it. My object was to learn from his own lips, by seeming indifference to the matter, whether he in reality had been black-hearted enough to send a man to perform so dastardly an act. He, however, pretended perfect innocence, and could divine no reason why I had been shot at." End quote. What this exchange illustrates is Joe's ability to wear whatever hat necessary in any given situation, and it was quite a remarkable character trait. He could play the persecuted religious leader, the Bible scholar, the pious prophet, the mouthpiece of God, and even play dumb, depending on the situation. And that's exactly what Joe did here. He tried a few different hats with Jackson and finally found one that fit. From this single interaction, according to Jackson at least, he gained the trust of the prophet, even though he had failed his mission. Joe gave him a place to stay in the Nauvoo mansion that night, but not before a parting word of what his plans were for Jackson. Quote, "Here ended our conversation for the evening, and Joe took me upstairs to my chamber. As he bade me good night, he pronounced the blessing of God on my head, and said that he never loved a stranger as he did me, and that he had trusted me further for a short acquaintance than he had ever done any man before. But, said he, you must kill old Boggs, and I will build you up in this world." In order to fathom the depths of Joe's villainy, I was obliged to appease to him as an abandoned wretch and outcast. When I told him I was a fugitive from justice and had committed the darkest crimes, it seemed to give him the greatest confidence, and he immediately run away with the idea that he could through me fulfill his prophecies, and then on top of it, he would urge me to carry out his measures in the name of the Lord. End quote. It's interesting because it seems that Joe thought he could still use Jackson to complete the mission that he had failed to complete in his recent trip to Missouri. Joe wanted Boggs dead so much, and he viewed Jackson as the perfectly situated guy to fulfill that prophecy. He was a scapegoat. But consider Joe's position here, right? Jackson was relatively new on the scene. Joe owed him absolutely no fealty. He had no value to Joseph Smith except of his ability to carry out Joe's plans. Jackson hadn't done that, so was still in a tenuous place with the prophet. Could Jackson be trusted? How much can you trust any mercenary who just randomly appears on the scene at a time when you're wanted by 2 different states and a territory? Joe's grasp on power was slipping, and Jackson provided an opportunity to slightly increase the power of that grasp, but only if he was truly loyal to the prophet. Continuing further in Jackson's expose, him and Joe took a little carriage ride together a few days after this little meeting. We'll forego discussing what happened there for the time being as it relates to polygamy, Doctrine and Covenants section 132, William Law, Hiram Smith, the Partridge Sisters, Emma Smith. That's all going to require an episode or 2 in and of itself, and that'll be coming very soon. But for now, we're going to skip that and cut to what happened next. We're kind of jumping around a little bit in the timeline here. So Joe received intel that Sheriffs Joseph Reynolds of Missouri and Harmon T. Wilson of Hancock County, Illinois, had the proper documentation in order and were headed to Nauvoo to arrest him, which is something that Jackson all along wanted to help these sheriffs do. What's interesting here is John C. Reckitt Bennett. That's a name that hasn't come up in a little while, but John C. Reckitt Bennett was still active on the scene. He'd been working with the Missouri government to procure the necessary documentation to arrest Joe on all of the old Missouri Mormon war crimes. And now Sheriff Reynolds was on his way to Governor Ford's office in Quincy, Illinois, in order to get a new writ of arrest and extradition for Joseph Smith. This is from pages 449 to 50 of Volume 5 of the Vogel History of the Church. Quote, "To show the wickedness and rascality of John C. Bennett and the corrupt conspiracy formed against me in Missouri and Illinois, I insert the following under date of the letter. Independence, Missouri, June 10th, 1843. To His Excellency Governor Ford of Illinois. Sir, for the last 3 months, I have been corresponding with Dr. John C. Bennett relative to one certain Joe Smith, Mormon prophet, etc. of your state. In several of Dr. Bennett's letters to me, he informs me that my name is known to you. Taking this for granted authorizes me without hesitation to write you full upon a subject that the people of this part of our state feel themselves vitally interested. At the last term of the Circuit Court of Daviess County, an indictment was found by the grand jury of said county against Joseph Smith for treason against this state. The necessary papers are now on their way to Governor Reynolds of Missouri, who, on the receipt thereof, I have no doubt, will make a requisition upon you for the apprehension and delivery of said Smith to the bearer, Mr. Joseph Reynolds, who goes as a special agent to attend this business, and I am in hopes that so soon as the proper papers come to hand, you will take that course and will secure this impostor and have him delivered over to Mr. Reynolds. Dr. Bennett further writes me that he has made an arrangement with Harmon T. Wilson of Hancock County. That's Hancock County, is Carthage is the seat of justice, in whose hands he wishes the writ that shall be issued by you to be put. From the tenor of his letters, I am induced to believe that he has made the same suggestions to you. The only wish of the people of this state is that this man, Joseph Smith, may be brought to that justice which the magnitude of his crime merits. Respectfully, your obedient servant, signed Samuel C. Owens, Commander-in-Chief of the mob in Jackson County. That's an addition, of course, by the compilers of the history of the church. So this is some new intel. This is, once again, Sheriff Reynolds and Sheriff Wilson of Missouri and Illinois, respectively, now had the documentation in hand, and they were ready to arrest Joseph Smith. So with this new intel, Joe knew that he was square in the crosshairs of these two sheriffs, and they had everything necessary to legally arrest him and extradite him to Missouri. Joe put the Nauvoo Legion on red alert to watch out for any intruders making their way into Nauvoo, expecting to be alerted if anybody made their way into the town to arrest him. A night watch was established. Now it's necessary to consider this situation from all angles here. Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson knew that if they entered Nauvoo, they would be quickly dealt with. Whether that meant the Nauvoo Legion running them out of town or them just simply disappearing at the hands of the Danites, these guys entering Nauvoo was embarking far behind enemy lines and hostile territory. They had the law on their side to arrest and extradite Joseph Smith, but laws are only effective when armies like the Nauvoo Legion don't keep you from enforcing them. Nauvoo was a criminal empire with Joe sitting at the top. It was part of the Union and the state of Illinois, but it behaved as a sovereign city-state. A criminal city-state is only beholden to the laws it begrudgingly is forced to abide by. Reynolds and Wilson knew that as soon as they had Joe in their custody, that they'd be in severe danger of the Nauvoo Legion bushwhacking them and springing their commander-in-chief. At that point, Joe would simply disappear into any of his dozens of rat holes in the city, and they would never get their hands on him again. The stakes for making this arrest were high, and the consequences held everybody's life in the balance. Joe was scheduled to lecture in a small town called Dixon, Illinois. It's about 170 miles from Nauvoo, about 100 miles directly west of Chicago. Joe brought his wife and kids with him, of course. So Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson became aware of this information and decided it best to make their arrest the day that Joe was scheduled to lecture in Dixon. However, Joe also received intel that day that they would be in Dixon waiting for him. So he decided to stay about 15 miles south at a member's house in a smaller village called Inlet, Illinois. So he sent a letter to the Dixon congregation that he wouldn't be able to preach to them that day, which they apparently were very much dissatisfied in learning. However, when that letter went out, the two sheriffs became privy to this new intel and traced the messenger, William Clayton, back to where Joe was currently hiding in Inlet, Illinois. This is how it all went down, beginning on pages 468 and 469 of Volume 5 of the History of the Church. Quote, I sent William Clayton to Dixon to try and find out what was going on there. He met Mr. Joseph H. Reynolds, the sheriff of Jackson County, Missouri, and Constable Harmon T. Wilson of Carthage, Illinois, about halfway, but they being disguised, they were not known by him. And when at Dixon, they represented themselves as Mormon elders who wanted to see the prophet. They hired a man and team to carry them, for they had run their horses almost to death. They arrived at Mr. Wasson's while the family were at dinner, about 2 p.m. They came to the door, said they were Mormon elders, and wanted to see Brother Joseph. I was in the yard going to the barn when Wilson stepped to the end of the house and saw me. He accosted me in a very uncouth, ungentlemanly manner when Reynolds stepped up to me, collared me. Then both of them presented cocked pistols to my breast without showing any writ or serving any process. End quote. Now, what happened here is all a reconstruction by Joseph Smith at a later time, so we have to take everything here with a grain of salt. But given the reaction of Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson, it sounds like Joe was probably struggling against the arresting officers, and he received what he considered to be brutal treatment by them in response to his protestations. Quote, Mr. Reynolds cried out, God damn you, if you stir, I'll shoot. God damn you, if you stir 1 inch, I'll shoot you. God damn you, be still or I'll shoot you, by God. I inquired, what is the meaning of all this? I'll show you the meaning, by God, and if you stir 1 inch, I'll shoot you, God damn you. I answered, I'm not afraid of your shooting, and I'm not afraid to die. I then bared my chest and told them to shoot away. I've endured so much oppression. I am weary of life, and kill me if you please. I'm a strong man, however, and with my own natural weapons could soon level both of you. But if you have any legal process to serve, I'm at all times subject to law, and shall offer no resistance. Reynolds replied, God damn you, if you say another word, I'll shoot you, by God. I answered, shoot away. I'm not afraid of your pistols. End quote. Now Joseph Smith was under the arrest of Constable Harmon Wilson from Carthage, Illinois, and Sheriff Joseph Reynolds of Jackson County, Missouri. They had him. They had the documentation they needed and the writ of extradition from Governor Ford of Illinois to move Joe across the state line to Missouri so he could finally face the proper criminal justice system that he had evaded for 4 years now. Getting Joe under arrest, that was the easy part. Now, they were 150 miles north and east of Nauvoo and had to transport Joe across most of Illinois before they would make their way into Missouri with him in their custody when they'd be considered safe. As soon as they had their pistols up against Joe's side, threats from all directions were realized because these sheriffs were in hostile territory and everybody was a potential threat. Stephen Markham, the prophet's personal detail during his trip to Dixon, saw these two unknown men pointing guns at his prophet with no explanation, and he decided to act. Markham, as a member of the Nauvoo Legion, had been training for this moment for years. Quote, By this time, Stephen Markham walked deliberately towards us. When they saw him coming, they turned their pistols from me to him and threatened his life if he came any nearer. But he paid no attention to their threats and continued to advance nearer. They then turned their pistols on me again, jamming them against my side with their fingers on the triggers, and ordered Markham to stand still or they would shoot me through. As Markham was advancing rapidly towards me, I said, "You're not going to resist the officers, are you, Brother Markham?" He replied, "No, not if they are officers. I know the law too well for that." End quote. So Markham backed off once Joe told him that these guys were lawmen, you don't want to mess with them. But how could Markham know that before Joe told him, right? He just saw a couple of guys holding guns on Joe and sprung into action the way a good Nauvoo legionnaire should. We should keep in mind that this whole ordeal is, it's a bit dramatized. It's recounted after Joe's return. He's the hero, masculinely baring his chest at the mobocrats and daring them to shoot him. He claims that they refused to produce documentation in order to prove that they were there on official business. Instead, they apparently continued to push Joe around with the muzzle of their pistols. Now, Joe was still in his nightclothes, though, and he petitioned the men to hold on for a moment so that Emma could bring out his hat and jacket. They refused, but the commotion outside drew Emma and the Smith children out of the home. Stephen Markham grabbed the reins of the horses and wouldn't let them leave until Emma brought out Joe's hat and some clothes and was able to say goodbye. But really, you can't blame the sheriffs here for trying to get Joe away from any of his allies here. I mean, regardless of his level of clothing, they wanted to get him away from anybody that he knew. Every person that Joseph Smith spoke to from the point he was arrested until they got to Missouri provided an opportunity for him to give them information that would bring the Nauvoo Legion crashing down on the posse. Now, the sheriffs had a choice to make. They could take Joe to Rock River, that's a tributary of the Mississippi, and canoe him downriver until they hit the Mississippi, and then board a steamer at Davenport, which would take him all the way to St. Louis, and then they'd have him safely in custody of the state of Missouri. But a 3-day river trip in a canoe, going only one direction, that was a vulnerable place for these sheriffs to have Joe in their custody. They'd be ambushed long before they even made it to the steamer in Davenport. Even if they did make it onto the steamer, they would have to go right past Nauvoo long before it hit St. Louis. So there's no way they could conceal Joe if they went by water. They could take him over land, south from Dixon through Peoria, but that meant that they would cross the Mississippi at Quincy, Illinois, a town of majority Mormons. That's where they first settled when they removed from Missouri back in 1839. So this route meant that halfway through their 450-mile journey to Jackson County, they'd be passing within a single day's ride of Nauvoo. How could they conceal Joseph Smith with this route? It would be impossible, and they'd be within Rough Rider range of thousands of Nauvoo legionnaires willing to die for Joseph Smith. It's two guys. They can't hold off the Nauvoo Legion. There was no easy option for these sheriffs to get Joe to Missouri because Nauvoo was directly between them and Missouri no matter what direction they went. That was a long-term plan they would think about once they could get Joe locked up for the night as darkness was beginning to fall. They chose to ride to the nearest tavern, which was in Dixon, where Joe was initially planning to preach, where they initially planned on arresting him. That was about 10 miles north from where they were. Stephen Markham rode ahead to Dixon in front of the carriage that they were taking Joseph in. And he did so in order to rally any Mormons that he could find in Dixon, where Joe was supposed to be preaching that day. But, he had canceled because of the threat of arrest. That didn't too much matter anymore, right? There ought to have been some friend in Dixon that Markham could appeal to in order to help him spring Joe from the sheriff's custody. Everybody is working just on instinct at this time. So the posse finally arrived at the tavern in Dixon, Illinois, much to the protestations of their prisoner. This was a town with many Mormons. The sheriffs were playing a dangerous game. Quote, "On arriving at the house of Mr. McKinney, the tavern keeper, I was thrust into a room and guarded there without being allowed to see anybody, and fresh horses were ordered to be ready in 5 minutes. I again stated to Reynolds, 'I wish to get counsel,' when he answered, 'God damn you, you shan't have counsel. One more word, God damn you, and I'll shoot you.' 'What is the use of this so often?' said I. 'I have often told you to shoot, and now I tell you again to shoot away.'" End quote. Reynolds and Wilson were denying Joe counsel while he was under arrest. Now, doing that was a violation of the Constitution. Sort of. It's violating the Constitution to deny a person legal counsel in a court of law. But these guys weren't trying Joseph Smith yet. They just had him in custody in order to transport him to that court of law. Regardless, there is some schadenfreude in seeing a guy like Joe, who flagrantly ignored any laws that were inconvenient to him, appealing to these sheriffs to follow the rule of law when they weren't actually doing anything that was particularly illegal. The sheriffs were on the defensive, though. It's important to understand how afraid they were, because they were not among friends and their prisoner could easily effect an escape should an opportune time arise. Stuff like this must have been a little bit stressing. Here it is, quote, "I saw a person passing and shouted to him through the window, 'I am falsely imprisoned here and I want a lawyer.' Lawyer Edward Southwick came and had the door banged in his face with the old threat of shooting him if he came any nearer. Another lawyer, Mr. Shepard G. Patrick, afterwards came and received the same treatment, which began to cause considerable excitement in Dixon. And Mr. Lucian P. Sanger asked Stephen Markham what was the matter, when he told them all, and stated that the sheriff intended to drag me away immediately to Missouri and prevent my taking out a writ of habeas corpus." End quote. You see, any of these guys walking by the tavern and hearing Joe's cries of false imprisonment could have been a member of the Destroying Angels, right? If anybody in this little town of Dixon had sworn their oaths of fealty, their blood oaths of fealty to the prophet, promising to defend his life at the cost of their own, these two sheriffs would be quickly overwhelmed. Once again, however, intel traveled at the speed of a horse, and Joe had only been in their custody for a few hours by this point. So the sheriffs were already in danger of a mob uprising, and they were only at their first stop with Joseph Smith in their custody. And that's just what happened. A mob formed outside the tavern, mostly of Mormons and Gentiles who were friendly to the Mormons. Quote, "Sanger soon made this known to Mr. Dixon, the owner of this house, and his friends, who gathered around the hotel door and gave Sheriff Reynolds to understand that if that was their mode of doing business in Missouri, they had another way of doing it in Dixon. They were all law-abiding people and Republicans, and gave Reynolds to understand that they should not take me without giving me an opportunity of a fair trial, and that I should have justice done me, but that if they persisted in their course, they had a very summary way of dealing with such people." End quote. What that means is, hey, sheriffs, let our prophet have some legal counsel, or we're going to deal with you the way that Illinois Republicans deal with Missouri Democrats. Sensing an uprising if they continued to oppose, the sheriffs finally granted audience of the prophet for his counselors. They were allowed to enter the room, but with Sheriff Wilson constantly keeping a gun on Joe in case he tried any funny business. Joe told them to get the local master in chancery to swear out a writ of habeas corpus. Stephen Markham, Joe's trusted friend throughout this whole ordeal, rode to the local justice of the peace and sued a writ of habeas corpus and filed a complaint of assault and threatening Joe's life. This led to Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson being arrested by the Dixon constable, while Joe was arrested by them. Then Sheriff Wilson did some legal trickery. Sheriff Wilson was constable of Carthage, Illinois, and beholden to follow the laws of Illinois. However, Sheriff Reynolds was a sheriff of Jackson County, Missouri, and was therefore only on special assignment to bring his target to Missouri and was not subject to the same laws as Sheriff Wilson. So, Sheriff Wilson transferred Joseph Smith to the custody of Sheriff Reynolds, which he wasn't supposed to do until they crossed the state line into Missouri. And all of this was happening while these two sheriffs had just been placed in the custody of the Dixon City Constable. Now, this pushed the case of Joe's custody to the Missouri sheriff and therefore into the jurisdiction of the Missouri courts, thus nullifying the writ of habeas corpus that Stephen Markham had just attained for Joseph Smith. However, now the issue of the sheriffs being in the custody of the Dixon Constable was something they had to deal with, meaning they sent their own messenger before the local justice of the peace in order to get their own writ of habeas corpus so that they could be released and remove Joseph to Missouri. Now, what all of this amounts to is Joseph Smith buying time. Undoubtedly, Emma and the people that the Smiths were staying with at Inlet, Illinois, they were on their way back to Nauvoo in order to alert, Hiram sidekick Abiff Smith and Bloody Brigham Young of the fact that Joe was in custody of a Missouri sheriff. Once that intel got to Nauvoo, the Legion would be brought out in full force, and the sheriffs were as good as dead, and Joe as good as free. But It was a 170-mile journey from Inlet to Nauvoo. And this information, once again, moved at the speed of horse, meaning that they were 4 to 5 days away with a fast rider from learning that Joseph Smith was captured and being able to do anything about it. So Stephen Markham brought back the writ of habeas corpus for Joseph Smith to present it to the sheriffs. They led him in the room, and he conveniently snuck a pistol into Joseph's pocket. This was not the first nor the last time that a friend of the prophet would smuggle a pistol to him while he was under arrest. Now, a Jack Mormon named Cyrus Walker was a lawyer who was out electioneering as a Whig candidate for Illinois' 6th Congressional District at this time. He was somebody Joe wanted by his side in order to help with these legal troubles. So Joe sent Stephen Markham to go find Cyrus Walker out on this election trail. Walker told Markham that he was too busy to represent Joe in this most recent legal spat. But then Markham told Walker that Joe would make it worth his while if Walker would go and help Joseph out in his time of need. Quote, Mr. Cyrus Walker told me that he could not find time to be my lawyer unless I would promise him my vote, and therefore the vote of all the Mormons. He being considered the greatest criminal lawyer in that part of Illinois, I determined to secure his aid and promised him my vote, and of course the entire Mormon voting bloc. Democracy in action, folks. He afterwards went to Markham and joyfully said, I am now sure of my election, as Joseph Smith has promised me his vote, and I am going to defend him. End quote. Now, in response to this little change in custody from Sheriff Wilson to Sheriff Reynolds of Missouri, a new writ of habeas corpus was sued, this time in Lee County District, instead of just, the small jurisdiction of Dixon City. Lee County is the county in which Dixon City is. This writ also alleged $10,000 in damages by the constables to Joe's person because, as Joe claimed, they were abusing him. The county justice of the peace, this is another Jack Mormon, sympathetic to the plight of the Mormons and possibly seeking re-election by gaining the Mormons' favor. This guy now placed Sheriff Wilson's and Reynolds into the custody of the Lee County Sheriff, not just the Dixon City Constable, but the Lee County Sheriff held on $10,000 bond. This forced the sheriffs to send a specific petition to Jackson County, Missouri, nearly 500 miles away, to have their bond removed by Governor Reynolds of Missouri. All of this just buying time. Time was on Joseph's side. Now, in order to sort out this entire legal mess that had been created by everybody arresting everybody, Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson had to take Joe to a hearing before Judge Caton, while still in custody of this Lee County Sheriff. So they made it to a town just outside of Ottawa, Illinois, named Paw Paw Grove. There was a hotel there. Now, Paw Paw Grove is just south and slightly east along the highway from Dixon, where they had initially held Joseph Smith. The sheriffs chose to confine Joe in the small hotel there for the night. So now they were further south than Dixon, meaning the population of nearby towns was increasingly Mormon because they were getting closer to Nauvoo. When the sheriffs and Joe got to town, a mob formed around the hotel, wondering why Joseph Smith, their prophet, was under arrest, and if these two sheriffs were just Missouri mobocrats coming to kidnap and kill their prophet. So they wanted to hear Joe's side. They wanted to have Joseph Smith make a public declaration, but the sheriffs wouldn't let him because who knows what Joseph Smith might say? Who knows how effective he would be at riling up this mob? They didn't know what to expect. Before I read this quote, keep in mind, there were ideological divides between the Republican abolitionist Illinoisans and the slave-owning, states' rights, blue-blooded Jacksonian Democrat Missourians that were attendant at this exchange. So the ideological divide back then across the state line from Illinois to Missouri is like the difference between California and Utah today, but only if Salt Lake City just dropped off the face of the planet, right? That's the ideological landscape we're dealing with here. So keep that in mind as we read through this next exchange. Quote, Sheriff Reynolds entered the room and said, pointing to me, I wish you to understand this man is my prisoner, and I want you should disperse. You must not gather round here in this way. I mean, obviously, he was fearing this mob uprising and lynching him, right? Upon which Mr. David Town, an aged gentleman who was lame and carried a large hickory walking stick, advanced towards Reynolds, bringing his hickory upon the floor. "You damned infernal puke! We'll learn you to come here and interrupt gentlemen. Sit down there," pointing to a very low chair, "and sit still. Don't open your head till General Smith gets through talking. If you never learn manners in Missouri, we'll teach you that gentlemen are not to be imposed on by a nigger driver. You cannot kidnap men here. If you do in Missouri, and if you attempt it here, there's a committee in this grove that will sit on your case, and, sir, it is the highest tribunal in the United States, as from its decision there is no appeal." End quote. So after this gentleman spoke to Sheriffs Reynolds and Wilson, Joe was allowed to speak. Now, this old guy referring to Joseph Smith as General Smith and talking about the highest tribunal in the United States, he wasn't talking about the Supreme Court. He was talking about the destroying angels, okay? Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds knew that if they made any mistakes with Joe in their custody, the Danites would be upon them quickly. So it's tense. It's a little intense here in little Paw Paw Grove. So the judge who was supposed to hear the cases of this writ of habeas corpus, he was to hear both the writs for Joseph Smith and the writs for the two sheriffs who had been arrested by the Lee County Sheriff. Unfortunately, he was on a very convenient little visit to New York. Maybe it was a nice night for him to take a vacation, so he couldn't hear their case. But they couldn't go any further without resolving the issue of arrest and habeas corpus writs, so instead they went back north to Dixon, Illinois, and threw Joseph Smith in the same room that they'd held him in 2 days prior. Throughout all of this, time was on Joseph's side. Every day that they didn't get closer to the Missouri border was another day that the Danites could formulate a plan to spring Joe from Reynolds and Wilson's custody. William Clayton, Joe's closest personal assistant and scribe, he had left Inlet, where Joe was staying, for Nauvoo as soon as Joseph Smith was arrested in order to tell the leadership in Nauvoo of what was going on with their prophet. On the day that Joe and the sheriffs arrived back at Dixon, after the exchange that we just read, the old gentleman, advocating for Joseph Smith to speak and everything, that's when William Clayton arrived in Nauvoo. And he immediately told Hiram's sidekick Abiff Smith of what had happened to his younger brother. Hiram called a special meeting in the Masonic Hall, but it was moved to the Grove because too many people showed up because there was so much commotion. Quote, "My brother Hiram went to the stand and requested the brethren to meet him at the Masonic Hall in 30 minutes. The brethren immediately went there in such great numbers that 1/4 of them could not get into the room, so they adjourned to the green and formed a hollow square, when my brother Hiram informed them that Elder William Clayton had arrived about 2, and told him that Joseph H. Reynolds, sheriff of Jackson County, Missouri, and Harmon T. Wilson of Carthage, had come upon me by surprise and arrested me, and related the occurrences, as far as known, up to my arrival in Dixon. He wanted a company to go up to my assistance and see that I had my rights. He called for volunteers, when upwards of 300 men volunteered, from whom they selected such as were wanted. Generals Law and Charles C. Rich of the Nauvoo Legion started the same evening with a company of about 175 men on horseback. Previous to starting, Elder Wilford Woodruff went to the company and donated a barrel of rifle powder, when every man filled his horn or flask. About 75 men on board the Maid of Iowa with Captain Dan Jones went up the Illinois River for Peoria and to examine the steamboats, suspecting I might be a prisoner on board one of them, as they supposed me on the road to Ottawa." End quote. The Danites were officially mobilized on land and water in search of Joseph Smith. The only information they were going on had come from William Clayton, who told them that they were taking Joe to Dixon. From Dixon, they could travel by land or water, but both routes would run right by Nauvoo, making it a dangerous situation for the sheriffs. However, they didn't have much to say in the matters because these two sheriffs were under the arrest of the sheriff of Lee County, who worked under the shadow command of Joseph Smith. So, after the writs of habeas corpus for Joe were returned as invalid because the judge Judge Caton just wasn't there. He was on a very convenient vacation to New York in order to hear the case. Joe acquired a new writ of habeas corpus, and this was to be heard in front of Judge Stephen A. Douglas at Quincy, Illinois. Stephen A. Douglas was a longtime friend of the Mormons because it was politically advantageous for him at the time. Stephen A. Douglas had helped pass the Nauvoo Charter. He had chaired a number of municipal court hearings relative to Mormon matters. He was a Jack Mormon through and through. This would come as a liability to him on the campaign trail against Abraham Lincoln. That's about a decade and a half out from where our timeline currently resides. But needless to say, Joe must have been elated to get his new writ to appear in front of Judge Stephen A. Douglas because he knew if he were granted that hearing without being dragged into Missouri first, he was home free because Douglas would grant the writ of habeas corpus. With the change of power into Joe's hands, he now dictated the actions of this posse, even though he was in the custody of the sheriffs. So Joe hired a man, this guy, Lucian P. Sanger, to carry them by coach to Quincy, Illinois. Just a few short miles, less than a day horse ride from Nauvoo. That's where they would appear before Judge Stephen A. Douglas, and that's when Joseph Smith would be home free. But Joe was still smart enough to protect against any funny business that Sheriffs Wilson or Reynolds might cook up in the 260-mile journey there. Quote, "After these arrangements were made, I sent Stephen Markham with a letter to General Wilson Law, directing him to meet me at Monmouth on Wednesday evening with sufficient force to prevent my being kidnapped into Missouri, as I well knew that the whole country was swarming with men anxious to carry me there and kill me without any shadow of law or justice, although they well knew that I had not committed any crime worthy of death or bonds." End quote. So this intel in the hand of Stephen Markham was making its way back to General Wilson Law, one of the major generals of the Nauvoo Legion, possibly also a member of the Danites. If there was a time in Joe's history when he needed Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell, this time was it. But unfortunately, Port was still languishing in Missouri jails because Joseph Jackson hadn't been successful in his mission to break out Port and finish off the Boggs job. However, Port received some intel of his own that Joe was arrested. This is from Porter Rockwell's own account after he returned to Nauvoo from Volume 6 of the Vogel History of the Church. Quote, "About the time that Joseph was arrested by Reynolds at Dixon, I, knowing that they were after him, and no means under heaven of giving him any information, my anxiety became so intense upon the subject, knowing their determination to kill him, that my flesh twitched on my bones. I could not help it, twitch it would. While undergoing this sensation, I heard a dove light on the window in the upper room of the jail and commence cooing, and then went off. In a short time he came back to the window where a pane was broken. He crept through between the bars of iron, which were about 2.5 inches apart. I saw it fly round the trap door several times. It did not alight, but continued cooing until it crept through the bars again and flew out through the broken window. I relate this, as it was the only occurrence of the kind that happened during my long and weary imprisonment, but it proved a comfort to me. The twitching of my flesh ceased, and I was fully satisfied from that moment that they would not get Joseph into Missouri and that I should regain my freedom." End quote. Joe's most trusted destroying angel, childhood friend, locked in prison, chained hands to ankles, freezing cold with no edible food, no money to purchase coal to burn in order to keep him warm, all while Port knew that Sheriff Reynolds was on his way to Dixon to arrest Joe. A single dove flying around his cell was the comfort he desperately needed to lift his anxiety. If only Joseph Jackson had been able to break him out of prison, but that was never Jackson's true intent. He was there to infiltrate the Mormons. He wanted to meet with Sheriff Reynolds before Reynolds made his arrest of Joseph Smith. However, Reynolds either wasn't aware of that fact or he considered Jackson to be totally in league with the Mormons. It's kind of up for grabs at the moment. Jackson's loyalties would be tested. Porter Rockwell's loyalties no longer needed testing. But Jackson Well, let's just see what he says about it. This is from his expose of August 1844. You'll find it in the show notes. Quote, "About this time, the bogus business commenced. Harmon T. Wilson returned from the South, and in company with him was Mr. Reynolds, the agent of Missouri, bearing a requisition from the governor of that state. When he returned, he heard reports in circulation that I had actually joined the Mormons, which so much diminished his confidence in me that he did not come to see me, as he promised he would. At this time, Joe was on a visit to Dixon's Ferry, and Wilson and Reynolds proceeded hither, reporting as they journeyed that they were Mormon preachers. In the meantime, word of what was on foot reached Nauvoo directly from Springfield, from whom I do not know. But at all events, Stephen Markham and William Clayton were dispatched to Dixon to warn Joe or to bring back word of what took place. In a few days, Clayton returned, bringing news that Joe was arrested, and an order immediately issued from Hiram for parties to start out to rescue Joe. One party I was placed in, and was compelled to go to prevent suspicion on myself. It consisted of 25 men. Our directions were to proceed directly to Dixon and release Joe at all hazards. I acted as pilot, and Dr. Foster proceeded ahead to reconnoiter. We were all armed with sidearms." End quote. Now, Joseph Jackson was a commissioned officer of the Danites, headed to break the prophet out of state custody at all hazards. Jackson and nearly 200 other men were canvassing the entire state of Illinois on land in search for the prophet. No cell phones, of course, so, Wilson Law or Hiram Smith couldn't just send a text to Joe, "Hey, where you at?" They had to travel all the major highways and attempt to cover all of the back roads in case the sheriffs were trying to outsmart them, all while another company proceeded up the Mississippi toward Davenport and Dixon to try and apprehend them should they be traveling by steamer. The night watch of the Nauvoo Legion was doubled, and there was a constant guard out during daytime hours in case Governor Ford decided to capitalize on this opportunity of the missing prophet to break down the city walls with an Illinois militia. It's crazy to me because what all of this amounts to is Joe having every single base covered. Let me tell you why. He had his people covering the entire state on all major roads looking for him and many back roads. He had people up and down the Mississippi ready to rescue him. All his boys were armed to the teeth and ready for action. Sure, he was in custody of the two sheriffs, but they were in the custody of his boy, and they were headed within a few miles of Nauvoo for a habeas corpus hearing that would be chaired by somebody who had shown broad fealty to Joseph Smith and the Mormons since their settlement in Nauvoo, Judge Stephen A. Douglas. Now, his primary destroying angel, Porter Rockwell, he may not have been there to help Joe, but dozens of men were there to step into Pistol Pack and Porter's place and give their life for Joe's. More than anything in this instance, though, Joseph Smith had time on his side. And beyond all of these variables being in his control, he also had a pistol smuggled on his person, which was force multiplied by his element of surprise. All it would take is a little bit of chaos, some inciting incident, and the sheriffs turning their back on him for just a moment, and he could kill them himself. Now consider this circumstance from the Missouri government's position, right? Sheriff Reynolds and Wilson, they had a very slim chance of success. Not only did they have to cross the entire state of Illinois through increasingly dense Mormon cities without a Mormon mob exerting their own vigilante justice, but after making the trip, they had to get a favorable ruling on their own writ of habeas corpus without Joe's writ of habeas corpus being granted in a hostile court chaired by somebody who was a Jack Mormon. And then they had to get him across the Mississippi and the state line of Missouri without being overrun by Danites, who would certainly kill them if their paths crossed. This is how the Mormon Mafia worked. Government officials who were supposed to keep demagogues in check, they were playing by the rules while Joe picked and chose whatever rules he wanted and all of his cronies would follow. There is no winning against a kingpin this powerful, and Joe would never willingly give up this much power. Nothing short of a military coup or an open battle between the Illinois militia and the rebel Mormon militia would ever unseat this despotic regime. Praise to this man? This is the guy Mormons sing their praises to and bear their testimonies about every month? This was not religious persecution. This was the due process of law, a system we all agreed to abide by, but apparently fails its quality control mechanisms when it suffers such flagrant abuse at the hands of one sociopath. That's how criminal empires are built. Small degrees of abusing the rule and order of law until a critical mass is reached where no system, regardless of how robust, can stop the wheels of revolution from turning. Sure, I mean, whatever. You get whistleblowers and rogue lawyers sounding the alarm, Nauvoo expositors out there, whatever, but by that time, it's far too late. The damage has been done. In 1843, much like in 2019, it's just too late. And that's going to do it for our show today. If you guys want an extra dose of history, I'm going to send you over to the most recent episode of Glassbox Podcast. It's episode 17, Slaves to the Man. Finally used the opportunity of Black History Month to tackle racism within the history of the Mormon Church. It shouldn't take Black History Month to do that, but it happened. It still happened. Braden and I really do quite a deep dive on the issue of racism in the church. So yeah, check that out if that's something that interests you. And, of course, check out the Patreon page for extended editions of every episode. And with that, I think we're all set for tonight. Thank you so much for joining me and lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.